My dad fired me from the family business to make room for my brother. 5 years later, my company bought his. My father fired me after I saved the family business, then handed my office to my brother. 5 years later, he sat across from me and begged my company not to buy his. He gave my brother the title. He gave me the reason to build something powerful enough to own it all. My father fired me from the company I had spent 12 years saving. Then he asked me to train the brother replacing me before security walked me out. The decision came at 4:17 on a Thursday afternoon, immediately after I finished presenting the strongest quarterly results Bennett Industrial had posted in 6 years. I had spent 40 minutes explaining how we had reduced late orders, renegotiated our steel contracts, and won back 2 medical equipment clients that had nearly left us. The board packet in front of my father showed a 12% increase in operating margin. For the first time since the recession, every production line was profitable. My father did not congratulate me. He closed the packet, folded his hands over it, and announced that the company needed new leadership. That leadership, apparently, was my younger brother, Kyle. Kyle had worked at Bennett Industrial for 11 months. His official title was Director of Strategic Growth, a role my father had invented after Kyle left his 3rd corporate job in 4 years. He arrived late, avoided the factory floor, and described our 78 machinists as labor overhead. I was the chief operating officer. I had started in purchasing at 23, back when our suppliers still faxed confirmations and our largest milling machine leaked coolant onto the floor. I learned scheduling, quality control, payroll, safety compliance, and every customer account we could not afford to lose. When my mother became ill, I handled her appointments in the morning and the second shift at night. When she died, I returned to the plant 4 days after the funeral because a hospital contract was about to collapse. My father had called that loyalty. On that Thursday, he called it an obstacle. He said Kyle needed room to establish authority and that the employees would never fully accept him while they continued coming to me for answers. My position was being eliminated, effective immediately. Kyle would assume responsibility for operations as president. The word president sat between us like a medal handed to someone who had never entered the race. I asked whether the board had voted. My father said Bennett Industrial was still his company. Technically, he owned 58% of the shares. My mother's estate had left 12% to me and 12% to Kyle, with the remainder divided among 2 retired executives. The board could advise. My father could decide. Kyle stared at the table during most of it. When he finally looked at me, his expression carried something worse than triumph. It carried relief. He had known. The previous week, he had asked me to document our supplier relationships, production schedules, maintenance calendar, and customer escalation process. He said he wanted to understand the business better. I had spent 2 evenings creating the files because I still believed competence could be taught to someone willing to learn. Those files were now stacked beside his chair. My father slid a severance agreement across the table. It offered 12 weeks of salary in exchange for my shares, a 2-year non-compete covering 6 states, and a promise not to make any statement that could damage the Bennett name. The shares alone were worth more than the severance, even using his own conservative valuation. I read every page. Then I pushed it back unsigned. My father's face hardened. He had expected pain. He had not expected preparation. For years, he had taught me never to sign a document because someone across the table wanted a quick answer. He had forgotten that his lessons still applied when he was the person applying pressure. He gave me until Monday. I told him he could have my answer immediately. I would leave. I would obey the confidentiality provisions already attached to my employment. I would not solicit Bennett customers or employees, but I would not surrender my shares, my right to work, or the truth in exchange for 12 weeks of pay. That was the longest conversation we had that day. My key card stopped working before I reached my office. A security guard named Luis met me beside the glass doors. He looked embarrassed. I made the moment easier for him because none of this was his fault. I gave him my company laptop and keys, then waited while an assistant packed my personal belongings into 2 copy paper boxes. The box contained a framed photograph of my mother, a pair of steel-toed boots, 3 notebooks, and the brass desk plate she had ordered when I became operations director. It did not contain customer lists, proprietary drawings, pricing files, or anything else my father could later accuse me of taking. I had spent too many years protecting Bennett Industrial to damage it on my way out. As I crossed the lobby, employees on the factory floor began receiving an email saying I had chosen to pursue opportunities outside the family business. I knew because 6 people texted me before I reached the parking lot. By dinner, the story had changed. My aunt said I had become too ambitious. A cousin said my father had offered me a generous transition, and I had responded selfishly. Kyle told one of our vendors that I was exhausted and wanted a different life. Nobody asked me. My father had controlled the company narrative for 35 years. He assumed he could control mine too. For the first month, I did almost nothing visible. I hired an employment attorney. She reviewed my agreements and confirmed that the non-compete in the unsigned severance had no force. My existing restrictions prohibited me from disclosing trade secrets and soliciting current Bennett accounts for 1 year. They did not prohibit me from building a different kind of manufacturing company. I also hired a corporate attorney to protect my minority shares. Then, I made a list of every problem I had seen across the industry that Bennett Industrial had refused to solve. Small manufacturers lost contracts not because they lacked skill, but because they could not absorb sudden demand. Large buyers wanted backup capacity, digital tracking, and reliable delivery across multiple specialized shops. The shops had machines sitting idle at different times, but no trusted system connected them. For 3 years, I had proposed a supplier network that would let independent plants share overflow work under one quality standard. My father dismissed it as helping competitors. Kyle called it a logistics app. It was neither. It was the beginning of Northline Manufacturing. I funded the first version with my savings, a home equity line, and a small investment from Priya Shah, a former Bennett quality manager who had left 2 years earlier. Priya understood the idea immediately. We would not take Bennett customers or copy Bennett processes. We would serve companies Bennett had never been equipped to serve and build our own quality system from the ground up. Our first office was a windowless room above a tire shop. The heat failed twice that winter. Priya and I wore coats while reviewing inspection reports. Our conference table was a used dining table with one leg shortened by a folded piece of cardboard. For 6 months, every large buyer told us the same thing. They liked the concept, but they would not trust a new company with critical parts. So we started with work nobody impressive wanted. Replacement brackets for commercial laundry systems, stainless housings for municipal pumps, short-run components for an agricultural sensor company whose previous supplier had gone bankrupt. We inspected everything twice. We delivered early whenever possible. When a subcontractor made a mistake, we paid to remake the order before arguing about responsibility. Trust arrived slowly, then all at once. The agricultural company introduced us to a robotics manufacturer. The robotics manufacturer needed emergency capacity after a fire shut down one of its plants. Our network moved the work across 4 shops and delivered the first shipment in 9 days. That contract paid off my home equity line. The next one allowed us to hire 2 engineers. Success did not make the early years easy. It only made the consequences of every mistake larger. Our 7th employee was a production planner named Marisol Vega. She could see a delayed order forming before anyone else noticed the missing material. Our 8th was an inspector named Owen Park, who believed small shops deserved the same measurement discipline as aerospace plants. I could not offer either of them the salaries larger companies paid. I offered transparency, profit sharing, and a promise that bad news would travel faster than flattering news. That promise was tested during our first major medical order. A partner shop reported that all 300 valve bodies had passed inspection. Owen checked a sample when the parts reached our temporary warehouse and found a bore drifting beyond tolerance. The difference was smaller than the width of a human hair, but the component controlled oxygen flow. We had 48 hours before shipment. The shop owner argued that the parts were acceptable. Our buyer had not yet discovered the problem. If we shipped them, there was a chance nobody would. I remembered how often my father had praised practical judgment when what he meant was hiding a problem until someone else owned it. We stopped the shipment. Northline paid for an independent inspection, informed the customer, and moved the replacement work to 2 other plants. Priya spent the night coordinating material. I drove parts between facilities because we could not afford a courier on that schedule. We delivered 1 day late and absorbed a loss equal to 2 months of payroll. The customer renewed the contract. Its quality director later told me the delay mattered less than the fact that we had reported the defect before being caught. That became the story people told about Northline inside the industry. Not that we never failed, but that we did not hide failure. My father heard a different version. He told a mutual supplier that I had nearly endangered a patient program because I did not understand machining. Kyle repeated that Northline was a paper company pretending to manufacture. Their comments reached a banker reviewing our first equipment loan. The banker asked whether I had been terminated from Bennett for performance reasons. I placed my final 3 years of audited operating results on his desk. I showed him the separation letter stating that my position had been eliminated. I showed him Northline's contracts, inspection records, and cash flow. Facts took longer than rumors, but they survived longer too. We received the loan. The harder problem was my 12% stake in Bennett. It produced no dividend after my departure. My father claimed all available cash had to be reinvested, yet company reports showed rising executive expenses and consulting fees paid to a firm owned by one of Kyle's college friends. My attorney advised me to document everything and avoid using shareholder rights as a weapon in commercial competition. I followed that advice. Northline created a written firewall. I did not use confidential Bennett information to pursue customers. Any opportunity involving an account I had served there went through legal review until my restrictions expired. That discipline cost us business. It also denied my father the scandal he wanted. At the end of Northline's first year, a defense supplier invited us to bid on an overflow contract. Bennett was one of the existing vendors. I declined before reviewing the drawings. Priya asked if I was protecting my father. I told her I was protecting us. There would be a day when Northline could compete with anyone without a footnote attached. I refused to arrive there by giving my family a legitimate reason to call our work stolen. The decision left our account nearly empty. For 6 weeks, I delayed my own salary. I sold the SUV my father had once mocked as too modest and bought a used hatchback. I rented my spare bedroom to a travel nurse. None of it appeared in the trade articles Kyle later described as proof that I had always had wealthy investors behind me. There were no wealthy investors. There was Priya's retirement account, my house, and a team agreeing to trust an idea that could still fail. On the night before our first annual meeting, I sat alone above the tire shop and calculated how many weeks remained before we would miss payroll. The answer was 9. The next morning, Marisol walked in with a referral from her former employer. A consumer appliance company needed 12,000 brackets after a supplier's stamping press failed. The margins were thin, the schedule was brutal, and no single partner in our network could handle the volume. Northline divided the tooling across 3 plants, established one inspection plan, and built a shared digital schedule that updated every 2 hours. We shipped the full order in 19 days. That job did more than keep us alive. It proved our network could operate like one factory without pretending the independent shops belonged to us. By then, people from Bennett were quietly calling. Some wanted jobs, some wanted to warn me. Most wanted to know whether Kyle's promotion had been planned before my dismissal. I refused to recruit anyone bound by agreements or carrying confidential files. I told every caller the same thing. I could listen to their experience, but I would not accept Bennett documents or ask them to violate obligations. 2 people joined Northline after finding work elsewhere first. 3 stayed at Bennett because they needed seniority and pension credit. I respected both decisions. Luis remained there because his wife was undergoing cancer treatment, and the company insurance covered her specialists. Denise, the scheduling coordinator, stayed because she was 9 years from retirement and believed the plant could survive any executive. Their choices reminded me that revenge was a luxury employees could not deposit at a bank. If Northline ever became large enough to affect Bennett, I wanted my decisions to protect the people who had no vote in my family's feud. By the end of our second year, Northline had 23 employees, partnerships with 14 independent plants, and revenue larger than Bennett Industrial had produced when I was fired. I did not call my father. He did not call me. I saw Kyle occasionally in trade publications. He rebranded Bennett Industrial as Bennett Global Solutions, even though the company still operated from one plant in Ohio. He renovated the executive offices, leased 2 luxury vehicles, and hired a marketing agency that photographed him in safety glasses he never wore on the floor. At family gatherings, my father praised Kyle's vision. I stopped attending. The distance was not dramatic. I simply became unavailable for rooms where my achievements were treated as provocation and my silence was treated as consent. The first warning about Bennett Industrial came from a supplier, not a relative. 18 months after my firing, a steel distributor called to ask whether Northline wanted extended terms. During the conversation, the account manager mentioned that Bennett had been moved to cash on delivery. I said nothing, but I understood what it meant. Kyle had abandoned the hedging contracts I negotiated because he believed spot prices would fall. They rose instead. Bennett was paying more for raw material while customers were still locked into annual pricing. The second warning was a public lien filed by an equipment lender. The third was a call from Luis, the same security guard who had walked me out. He did not ask for a job. He only wanted me to know that the second shift had been cut and people were scared. I checked the public records available to any shareholder. Bennett had borrowed heavily against the plant to finance an expansion into aerospace work. Kyle announced the program before securing the required certification. The equipment arrived, the loan payments began, and the expected contracts did not. My father sent shareholder reports late and stripped of useful detail. Through my attorney, I exercised my inspection rights. His response accused me of using my ownership to spy for a competitor. We answered with the relevant state statute and a narrow request for audited statements, board minutes, debt schedules, and related party transactions. The documents arrived 3 months later. They showed a company bleeding in ways a new logo could not conceal. They also showed why my father had fought the request. Kyle's compensation was tied to revenue growth rather than collected cash or profit. The electric vehicle contract allowed him to announce record sales, even while invoices aged unpaid. Each new purchase order increased his bonus. Each delayed payment became someone else's problem. The board minutes recorded almost no challenge. One retired executive had asked whether the customer's financial condition had been reviewed. My father answered that Kyle had built a strategic relationship and excessive caution would cost the company its future. The question disappeared from the next meeting. There were related party payments too. Bennett Global Solutions had paid $420,000 over 2 years to a consultancy called KBR Strategic. Its registered address was a mailbox. Its managing member was Kyle's closest friend from business school, a man whose manufacturing experience consisted of selling software subscriptions. The consultancy had selected the scheduling platform that disrupted medical orders. It had also recommended the aerospace expansion and received a fee when the equipment financing closed. Kyle had disclosed that the owner was a friend. He had not disclosed that he held a 20% interest through another company. The ownership trail was visible in public filings, but only if someone compared 3 states and 2 shortened versions of his name. My attorney sent the findings to Bennett's board and requested a special committee of independent directors. My father responded by scheduling a shareholder meeting. It was held in the same conference room where I had been fired. For the first time in 5 years, I returned to the executive floor. My old office belonged to Kyle. He had replaced my mother's brass desk plate with a glass sign reading, President and Chief Vision Officer. The title would have been funny if the company beneath it had not been in danger. My father opened the meeting by describing Northline as an aggressive competitor exploiting family access. He proposed amending the shareholder agreement to restrict inspection rights when a shareholder owned a competing business. The amendment required more votes than he controlled. One retired executive, Arthur Bell, had spent 30 years beside my grandfather. He asked my father why a healthy company needed to hide audited statements from an owner. My father said the issue was loyalty. Arthur said loyalty did not reconcile a balance sheet. The amendment failed. That vote changed nothing immediately. Kyle remained president. My father remained controlling shareholder. But for the first time, their authority had met a boundary inside the room they treated as private property. 2 weeks later, Bennett's controller resigned. Her name was Evelyn Ross. She had worked there since I was in college and had never missed a reporting deadline. My father announced that she wanted retirement. Evelyn called me from her attorney's office. She did not bring documents. She did not ask for employment. She wanted to know whether the board had received her written concerns about covenant calculations. It had not. She had warned Kyle that receivables from the electric vehicle startup could not be counted at full value after the customer stopped paying. Removing them from eligible collateral would place Bennett in default under its loan. Kyle instructed her to submit the borrowing certificate unchanged. When she refused, my father told her to take accumulated leave and consider whether she still fit the company's direction. Evelyn's attorney sent her concerns directly to the lender and the independent directors. The bank ordered a field audit. That audit was the point at which Bennett's decline stopped being a family secret. Auditors found invoices recorded twice, inventory valued above cost, and rejected parts included as finished goods. They found equipment listed at the Calder Road plant that had been moved to a warehouse owned by KBR Strategic and pledged in a separate financing proposal. My father blamed accounting confusion. Kyle blamed Evelyn. The lender blamed the signatures on the certificates. Northline had no role in the investigation, and I made sure it stayed that way. We did not contact Bennett customers with rumors. We did not issue public statements. When a trade reporter called, I said only that I remained a minority shareholder and could not comment on confidential matters. Silence frustrated my family because they could not point to it as an attack. They attacked anyway. My aunt circulated a letter saying I was trying to force my father into retirement. Kyle told relatives that I had recruited Evelyn to invent a default. At my cousin's wedding, 3 people moved away when I approached because they did not want to be involved. I left before dinner. In the hotel elevator, I understood something I should have learned the day of my firing. People who benefit from a false story do not become neutral when shown evidence. They become afraid of what the truth will require them to admit. I stopped trying to correct the family version. At Northline, there was too much real work to do. Year 3 brought our most dangerous growth decision. A private equity fund offered enough capital to expand into 4 states. The presentation promised accelerated scale, national sales, and a valuation that would make my original shares worth more money than anyone in my family had ever held. The terms gave the fund control after 1 missed performance target. 5 years earlier, I might have accepted because I wanted proof that leaving Bennett had not diminished me. By then, I understood that fast money often arrived carrying someone else's definition of success. We declined. Instead, we raised a smaller round from 2 industry operators and created an employee ownership pool. The growth was slower. The company remained ours to govern. That choice became important when a flood shut down 3 partner plants the following spring. For 10 days, we rerouted work, paid emergency freight, and continued wages for employees who could not enter the damaged facility. Our quarter missed its target. Under the private equity agreement, control could have shifted. Under our structure, the board asked whether we had protected customers and people. We had. That was the company I had wanted to build, even before I knew how to describe it. Kyle had moved profitable medical work onto an untested scheduling platform without running parallel systems. 2 late shipments triggered penalty clauses. A 3rd customer left after parts were sent without complete inspection records. Executive compensation had increased, while overtime on the factory floor was frozen. The most damaging decision was also the simplest. Kyle had concentrated nearly 40% of revenue in 1 electric vehicle startup because he wanted to announce a transformative partnership. Bennett bought specialized equipment and accepted 90-day payment terms. The startup missed its forecasts, delayed production, and stopped paying invoices. My father had approved every major decision. He had not been tricked by Kyle. He had chosen him repeatedly. Northline continued growing. In year 3, we opened our own inspection laboratory. In year 4, we purchased a small machining company from a retiring owner and kept every employee. We used that plant as the stable center of our supplier network rather than trying to own every machine ourselves. By year 5, we employed 162 people directly and supported hundreds more through partner shops. Our annual revenue was nearly 4 times Bennett's declining sales. Still, I never imagined buying my father's company. The idea came from a bank in the form of a confidential acquisition brief. Northline's chief financial officer placed the document on my desk on a rainy Tuesday morning. The cover used a project name, but the numbers were familiar before I reached the second page. 78,000 square feet, 46 active machining centers, a pension obligation with 61 participants, an industrial property on Calder Road. Bennett Industrial had defaulted on its senior loan. The bank had signed a forbearance agreement giving the company 90 days to find new capital or a buyer. If it failed, the lender could force liquidation. Kyle's electric vehicle customer owed Bennett more than $3 million and had entered bankruptcy. Payroll taxes were current, but several suppliers were not. The pension plan was underfunded. A liquidation would likely close the plant, sell the machines separately, and leave most employees without work. My first reaction was not satisfaction. It was grief. I could picture the calibration room, the tool crib, the old break room where my mother used to bring chili during inventory weekend. I knew which employees were close to retirement and which ones had children in college. They had not chosen Kyle. They had simply needed their jobs. Our board did not share my history, so I presented the opportunity without sentiment. Bennett still held valuable certifications, a trained workforce, and long-term customers whose contracts had survived the chaos. Its plant could expand Northline's capacity in a region where we were turning away work. The purchase price was low because the debt was high, but the turnaround would require new capital, new management, and immediate credibility with suppliers. It was a risky acquisition. It was also a good one if the terms were right. The first board discussion lasted 4 hours. One director asked the question everyone else was carefully avoiding. Could I make an objective decision about buying the company that had fired me? I said I could make a disciplined decision, which was not the same as pretending I had no feelings. I wanted the plant to survive. I wanted my father and brother removed from management. I wanted the employees protected. Those interests overlapped with Northline's only if the price, liabilities, and operating plan worked. If independent diligence showed they did not, I would vote against the acquisition. The board appointed Priya to lead operational review and hired outside counsel who had never represented me or Bennett. I received the same sanitized reports as other directors and did not enter the data room containing competitively sensitive customer information until the bank authorized final stage access. The discipline protected the transaction. It also forced me to watch strangers reduce my family history to assets and liabilities. The plant roof required $600,000 in repairs. Environmental testing found an old solvent area that needed remediation. 21 machines were useful, 14 needed work, and 11 were worth less than the cost of moving them. The customer list was smaller than my father had admitted, but more loyal than the financial statements suggested. Several purchasing managers said they would remain if management changed and delivery controls were restored. The employee interviews were the hardest part. Workers described maintenance requests delayed for months while the executive wing was renovated. They described quality holds released by email without inspector approval. They described Kyle announcing layoffs at 10 in the morning and hosting a branding lunch upstairs at noon. Denise showed our team the private scheduling spreadsheet she had maintained to prevent the official system from assigning one machine to 3 orders at the same time. Louise showed us incident reports for a loading dock gate that had failed twice. Neither asked me to punish anyone. They asked whether Northline would keep the health plan through the transition. That question shaped our bid more than my family name ever did. We calculated the cost of funding benefits without interruption. bringing pension contributions current, repairing the dock, replacing 2 critical machines, and carrying payroll through a 6-week production reset. The number was painful. Our CFO told me the acquisition would delay a new Northline facility we had planned in Indiana. It would also reduce our cash reserve to the lowest level permitted by our own lenders. There would be no cinematic victory. If we bought Bennett, we would spend the next 2 years earning the right to call the decision wise. I recused myself from the initial valuation committee and disclosed every personal connection. An independent team reviewed the assets, contracts, environmental reports, pension exposure, and customer retention risk. Their conclusion was colder than mine. Northline should bid, but only through a lender-controlled sale that eliminated the Bennett family's management authority, required full financial disclosure, and transferred the assets without hidden liabilities. We submitted a proposal. It was not the highest headline offer. A private equity group offered slightly more cash, but planned to close the Ohio plant and move the best equipment to Tennessee. Our bid preserved 69 jobs on closing, funded the pension shortfall, honored accrued vacation, and committed to keep the plant operating for at least 3 years. The bank preferred our certainty. The employees preferred our plan. The largest remaining customers preferred my name on the turnaround team. That was when my father learned who was behind Northline's offer. He called me for the first time in 5 years. I watched his name light up my phone until the call ended. Then an email arrived asking for a private family meeting before the bank made a decision. My attorney advised me not to attend alone. My board advised me not to attend at all. I agreed to a formal meeting with counsel present because personal history had already affected the transaction, and pretending otherwise would not protect anyone. My father entered the conference room looking older than he had in my memory. Kyle entered behind him wearing the same kind of expensive suit he had worn the day I was fired. This time, it did not fit his confidence. They had not come to apologize. They came with a restructuring proposal. Before my father began, he placed a folder on the table with the Bennett crest embossed in blue. Inside was an organizational chart. He had assigned himself executive chairman, Kyle president, and me chief integration officer. Priya and Northline's CFO were placed beneath Kyle. The company I had built appeared as a division of Bennett Global Solutions. The arrogance was almost clarifying. They did not understand the transaction because they still did not understand what I had built. Northline was not a pile of money waiting to rescue them. It had a board, lenders, employees, customers, and governance rules. I could not hand it to my father even if some wounded part of me wanted his approval. Kyle presented projections showing Bennett returning to profit within 6 months. The model assumed the bankrupt customer would pay every outstanding invoice, suppliers would forgive late balances, and Northline would transfer 3 large contracts without compensation. Our CFO asked why the projection included no pension contribution. Kyle said legacy obligations would need to be renegotiated. That was the polite phrase for asking machinists to absorb the cost of his decisions. My father said families were supposed to solve problems privately. I looked around the room at the bank's counsel, turnaround advisor, independent director, and the binders documenting years of public liens. The problem had stopped being private when they pledged the livelihoods of 78 families to protect 2 titles. Northline would invest enough cash to stop the default. My father would remain chairman. Kyle would continue as president with operational oversight from my team. In exchange, I would receive additional Bennett shares and public recognition as a returning family executive. They spoke as if I had spent 5 years building Northline for the privilege of returning to the desk they took from me. I let them finish. Then our counsel explained that Northline was not offering a family investment. It was offering to purchase the operating assets through the bank process. Existing management would have no role. Existing shareholders, including me, would receive value only after secured debt and transaction obligations were satisfied. Kyle said I was using the bank to steal the company. The accusation might have hurt if the facts had not been sitting in binders around us. I had not chosen the failed expansion, the customer concentration, the unpaid suppliers, or the loans secured against the plant. I had not removed cash from operations to renovate executive offices. I had not hidden monthly reports from minority shareholders. I had built a company capable of making a bid. That was the only part of the crisis I had created. My father turned away from the attorneys and looked directly at me. He said Bennett Industrial was my grandfather's legacy. I knew that better than either of them. My grandfather's legacy was not the brass letters on the building. It was the promise that skilled people would be paid fairly for making something dependable. It was the pension he started before competitors offered one. It was the rule that executives walked the factory floor before looking at a spreadsheet. Kyle had preserved the name and discarded the promise. I told my father Northline's bid would preserve the promise, but it would not preserve his control. The meeting ended without an agreement because there was nothing for the three of us to negotiate. The bank owned the decision now. 2 weeks later, Kyle tried to assemble a competing investor group. Their financing collapsed during diligence when 2 customer contracts proved cancelable after a change in control. A week after that, my father pledged personal property for a bridge loan, but it was not enough. Then someone tried to remove the evidence. 3 nights before the bank's final decision, Luis called our acquisition counsel. A shredding company had arrived after business hours with instructions to destroy archived quality files and finance boxes stored beside the old records room. Luis had checked the destruction order. The signature belonged to Kyle. The lender's forbearance agreement prohibited disposal of company records. Counsel contacted the bank, which sent a representative and secured the room before anything left the property. Most of the boxes contained ordinary records. 4 did not. They held manual inspection releases, copies of equipment invoices, and correspondence showing that KBR Strategic had received a success fee for financing machines that never became operational. One folder documented a rejected aerospace trial lot that Kyle had described to investors as qualified production. The discovery ended any possibility that he would remain during a transition. It also led the bank to shorten the deadline. My father called the next morning and said Kyle had panicked. He asked whether one bad decision should erase a lifetime of family work. I thought of the day he fired me. He had erased 12 years with one decision and called it leadership. I did not say that. I told him the bank and counsel would handle the records issue. Northline's offer remained unchanged. For once, I did not use his crisis to collect an apology. I did not need one badly enough to weaken the terms protecting everyone else. On the 88th day of the forbearance period, the bank accepted Northline's offer. The closing took place at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. 5 years and 3 months after security escorted me out of Bennett Industrial, I signed the document transferring its operating assets to my company. There was no applause. The most important transactions rarely look dramatic in the room. They are signatures, initials, wire confirmations, and exhausted attorneys checking schedules one final time. Kyle did not attend. My father sat at the far end of the table because his signature was required on several releases. When the final document reached him, his hand paused above the line. For a moment, I remembered being 12 years old and following him through the plant on a Saturday. He had placed my hand on the side of a machine and told me to feel the vibration because good operators could hear trouble before instruments detected it. He had taught me to listen. He had simply stopped listening when the warning came in my voice. He signed. That afternoon, I returned to the Calder Road plant. Nobody escorted me. I walked through the same glass doors carrying no box, only a folder containing our first-day plan. The lobby still displayed the company's original brass sign. We had decided to rename the facility Northline Calder Works, but we kept a smaller Bennett Founders plaque inside to honor the employees and history without pretending the last 5 years had been successful. The factory gathered around the main assembly area. Some faces were new, many were not. Luis stood near the back. Priya stood beside me. I did not give them a victory speech. They did not need my family history turned into workplace theater. I told them what would happen next. All 69 retained employees would receive written offers by the end of the day. Accrued vacation would transfer. The pension contribution would be funded at closing. Safety repairs would begin immediately. Supervisors would be interviewed, not automatically replaced. Production would pause for 2 days so we could verify every schedule, tool, and quality record before promising customers anything. Then I answered questions until there were none left. The turnaround took 18 months. It was harder than the acquisition model predicted. The first week revealed how thoroughly fear had replaced management. Supervisors had been rewarded for reporting good numbers, so every department kept a second set of private warnings. Maintenance logged urgent repairs in a notebook hidden beneath a workbench. Quality inspectors photographed questionable approvals on their personal phones. Purchasing employees maintained an unofficial list of suppliers who would still answer calls. We created one system for bad news: no retaliation, no punishment for reporting inherited problems, no performance bonus based on numbers that could be improved by delaying an honest entry. For the first month, the reports looked worse every day. That was progress. We found coolant leaking near electrical lines, gauges past calibration, orders scheduled against unavailable steel, and a customer complaint Kyle had marked closed without contacting the customer. Priya wanted production paused for an additional week. It would cost nearly $500,000. I approved it. My father had once taught me that a quiet machine was cheaper than a dishonest shipment. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped following his own rule. I did not have to reject every lesson just because he had betrayed some of them. The pause let us rebuild the schedule from actual capacity. Denise led the work. When I announced her promotion to planning manager, she cried in the same conference room where Kyle had blamed her for delays his software created. She had been doing management work for 3 years without the title or pay. The change mattered more to employees than removing the Bennett sign. So did the first pension deposit. We posted confirmation in the break room after the funds cleared. Luis stood in front of it for several minutes. One machinist took a photograph to send his wife. Those were the moments I remembered when relatives accused me of buying the company to humiliate my father. Humiliation was not in the budget. Roof repairs were. Health insurance was. Calibration was. Back pay for employees incorrectly classified to avoid overtime was. 2 machines needed replacement rather than repair. 1 customer left despite our assurances. Several suppliers demanded deposits until we rebuilt credit. We discovered boxes of rejected parts that had been moved off the production floor before lender inspections. We also found more strength than the financial statements showed. The machinists knew which processes were wasting time. The maintenance team had kept old equipment running with almost no budget. A scheduling coordinator named Denise had maintained a private spreadsheet because Kyle's expensive software produced impossible delivery dates. We promoted her. We listened to the floor. Within 9 months, on-time delivery rose above 95%. Within a year, every retained employee had received a performance bonus. By the end of the 18th month, Calder Works was profitable without eliminating the pension or cutting wages. The 69 jobs we promised to preserve became 76. Evelyn returned for 6 months as an independent advisor to rebuild financial controls. She refused a permanent role because retirement had become attractive after all. On her last day, she left a framed copy of the first clean covenant report on my desk. Arthur Bell visited the plant during the first profitable quarter. He walked the floor without ceremony, shook Denise's hand, and said my grandfather would have recognized the place again. I did not know whether that was true, but I knew the employees recognized themselves in it again. The legal consequences arrived more slowly. The lender referred the borrowing certificates and attempted record destruction to federal investigators. I was interviewed twice because of my ownership history and the acquisition. I answered every question with counsel present and supplied only records Northline lawfully controlled after closing. Kyle's attorney tried to frame the case as a family dispute created by an embittered sister. Bank records did not have siblings. The duplicate invoices, false collateral reports, and KBR payments existed no matter how anyone felt about me. Evelyn's warnings had dates. The destruction order had a signature. Warehouse cameras showed the equipment Bennett had claimed remained at Calder Road. Kyle eventually pleaded guilty to 1 count involving a false statement to the lender. He avoided prison but received probation, restitution, and a prohibition against serving as an officer of a company receiving federally backed financing. My father was not charged. Investigators concluded that he had approved reckless decisions and ignored obvious warnings, but they could not prove he understood every false certificate Kyle submitted. The distinction mattered in court. It mattered less to the people whose pensions had nearly disappeared. Some relatives treated the absence of charges as proof that my father had done nothing wrong. Others stopped discussing the company entirely. A few sent careful messages saying they had never believed Kyle's version, though I remembered who had left me alone at the wedding. I did not publish a list of enemies. I also did not confuse late neutrality with courage. Northline purchased Bennett's assets, not its family mythology. My original 12% shares were extinguished after secured creditors and transaction costs consumed the old company's value. On paper, I lost the stake my mother had left me. That surprised people who assumed the acquisition made me rich overnight. I had not bought my father's shares and placed the money in his pocket. Northline had paid the bank and funded the liabilities required to keep the plant alive. My ownership in Northline meant I shared the risk of every dollar invested. For almost a year, the Calder facility reduced our company's earnings. I earned less after buying it than I had the year before. That detail never appeared in Kyle's story. Neither did the employee ownership pool. When Calder Works reached its first full profitable year, every eligible employee received Northline units. Denise, Luis, Marisol, Owen, and the people who had survived both regimes became owners in the company their work had rescued. My grandfather had believed ownership should remain in the family. I had learned to ask a different question. Who had behaved like family when the building was failing? The answer was standing on the factory floor. Kyle moved to another state and began describing himself online as a former manufacturing executive. He never admitted what happened. I learned not to expect truth from someone who experienced accountability as persecution. My father retired. For several months, he sent messages through relatives saying I had humiliated him. Later, the messages changed. He wanted to tour the plant. He wanted to discuss the family name. He wanted to know whether there might be an advisory role. I declined the role. Eventually, I agreed to meet him for coffee, away from the office. He told me he had believed Kyle needed a chance. I said giving Kyle a chance had never required taking mine away. He looked down at the table for a long time. There was no perfect apology. No speech repaired the day he replaced 12 years of work with a decision made behind a closed door. But he finally admitted that he had confused inheritance with leadership and obedience with loyalty. I accepted the admission. I did not restore his authority. Those were different things. Today, the desk plate my mother gave me sits in my office at Northline headquarters, not because I need proof of the title I once held, but because it reminds me how small my future used to be. My father believed the family business was the greatest thing he could give one of his children. He gave it to my brother because he saw succession as a birthright. What he gave me was an exit. It felt like rejection at the time. It became room. Room to build a company where leadership had to be earned. Room to create systems that did not depend on one family's approval. Room to become the kind of owner who knew that saving a name meant nothing if you sacrificed the people carrying it. 5 years after my father fired me to make room for my brother, my company bought his. But the purchase was not the revenge. The revenge was that I did not have to destroy what they lost in order to prove I could lead it. I saved the jobs, funded the promises, removed the men who believed ownership excused failure, and walked back through the doors on terms no one in my family had the power to dictate. They had made room for Kyle. In the end, they made room for me to build something large enough to buy the whole building.